Gavin Francis. I've read his book, True North, and I was just telling him before the session how much I could relate to the Norse people and the Norse myths and the legends and how Brittany some of them even are. It's very interesting, and I think he seemed very pleasantly surprised by that. Gavin Francis, of course, is an award-winning author, and just a few minutes ago we found out that his book Empire Antarctica is actually sold out. So there's none left for us who would like to buy it, quite sadly. I'm hoping you'll mail one to me, signed and autographed all the way from Scotland.
Of course.
Gavin Francis is a father of three. He's got these three, I think, quite rambunctious kids, from the sound of it. He practices medicine twice a week and writes twice a week and travels extensively. I am really, really jealous that he's been on all 7 continents and has widely traveled all 7 continents. I don't think there's many of us who could achieve that in a lifetime. So I'm very, very happy to be sitting here and talking to you. Gavin will actually be beginning with an introduction to the kind of work that he's done, what he's written about, and his experiences.
Is that bit? Oh yes. And I'm going to check if this clicker works. It's missing a AAA battery in the back, is that an issue? Sorry. So thank you for that very generous introduction. I was asked to wear this kilt today. Normally it's an evening formal wear, and I was wearing it last night for an evening event, and Namita made me promise I would wear it today. So I feel a bit unusual. It's a bit like a go, but not quite. So yeah, I feel slightly odd about wearing it during the daytime, but not to worry. So I'm going to try, and the title of this session was Sounds of Silence, and Mita spoke to me about doing a session on landscapes that involve a great deal of silence, where silence is a possibility, where contemplation and austerity within the landscape are normal, because a lot of my travelling and 2 of my published books so far deal very much in these very silent, austere landscapes. So I'm going to, sorry, the clicker isn't working. I'm going to explain a little bit about my journey through those sorts of places. Now, I live in Edinburgh in Scotland. This is a picture of Edinburgh. And it's a city, it's not the noisiest city in the world. I'm sure it is a lot quieter than New Delhi. At night time, with the barking dogs you have here, Edinburgh is probably quieter than Thimphu. But Scotland itself has a lot of beautiful landscape. Can you switch? It's a very austere, very remote parts of Scotland, and I spent a lot of my youth travelling and camping around these places and developed a love for that sort of landscape. Wherever you go in Scotland, you're never far from the sea, and the weather coming in off the North Atlantic is often very extreme. But it's a beautiful, beautiful landscape, and one that I grew very used to. But when I qualified in medicine, one of my first jobs was I went to work in East Africa, and I was living and working in the tropics, in a very different environment, a very hot, very populated, lots of enormous flying insects. And when I finished my time working in East Africa, I decided, in order to gain some sort of inner balance again, I wanted to go and experience the opposite. I wanted silent landscapes again. And so I went back to Scotland. I think I spent 1 weekend in Edinburgh, but I kept going north. I kept going north from Scotland. You reach a set of islands called the Faroe Islands, which are halfway between Scotland and Iceland. Continued on to Iceland and travelled around there. Then beyond Iceland you reach Greenland, and just like many parts of Bhutan, there are large areas of Greenland where the mountains have never been climbed. Many of them are unnamed, and the country is about a third the size of Australia, so it's enormous, but the population is 50,000. So the political autonomy of Greenland is also an interesting discussion, and how they manage that enormous resource with quite so few people, something we can also talk about later maybe. I was going to do a very, very short reading. There's a famous quote attributed to Chekhov, which I don't know if it's true. I've never been able to find the primary source. But it says, hell is when somebody starts to speak and you don't know when he will end. So I'm going to, when I read, it's only going to be for half a minute. This is describing hiking into Greenland. For the first couple of hours of the hike, I climbed up through thickets of dwarf birch and onto a rolling heathland, finely lined by caribou tracks. The lake valley was like a silver offertory plate, circled by green velvet folds of the mountains. There was a delicious silence in the valley, a noiselessness made richer by occasional croaking calls of ptarmigan or the footfalls of caribou as they wandered by. In the late evening the sky began to clear, but a sheet of cloud remained, draped over the hilltops like a drying canvas. As the sun set in the north, it glowed orange, crimson, then lilac. And so exploring Greenland, which is an extraordinarily empty landscape, was my first taste really of a polar region, a truly polar region. But from Greenland I went on to Svalbard up near the North Pole. This is a book is being held up just to cover the sun so that you can see the arc of light around the sun caused by frost crystals in the atmosphere near the North Pole. This photo was taken at midnight. And then from Svalbard on, I did also go hiking, but you can just about make out my rifle on my shoulder for the polar bears. If you carry on. And then I travelled back down through Lapland. And Lapland is largely, the interior of Lapland is a landscape of forests and lakes, very, very empty, very beautiful, many national parks like there are here. And the coast, the western coast, the Norwegian side of Lapland is very much more mountainous. This is the Lofoten Islands where the mountains meet the sea in the North Atlantic, but they're high above the Arctic Circle. So they have a weather similar to Scotland, except in winter you might go a couple of months with no sunrise. If you just move on, thanks. So I wrote a book about that journey. And carry on, thanks. You just carry on. But I enjoyed the Arctic so much that I decided I had to go and see the other extreme. I wanted to go to the Antarctic. So I got myself a job as the doctor on a remote research station in Antarctica and sailed from Grimsby in England. It took me 2 months to get to Antarctica. You just change. And to reach this remote station where I lived. And if you imagine a map of the world, and you have South America and you have Africa, if you drew a line straight down halfway between South America and Africa, that's where I was. And in midsummer, this is midsummer, the sea is still frozen 4 meters thick. And the ship, if you just swap, the ship cuts its own harbour out of the frozen sea surface and offloads the cargo onto the sea ice. And then snowcats pull up the cargo, you can see it laid out there, lorry containers. They drag it up on sledges to the base itself, which is another 20 kilometres in from the edge. Just change. And that's the base. So I lived on that base, surrounded by ice, no rocks, no neighbours for 1,000 miles, for just under a year and a half, and experienced the very extreme weather that it has there, 150 mile an hour winds, and at 75 degrees south there's 3.5 months where the sun doesn't rise, and in the summer 3.5 months where the sun doesn't set. So it's a very magnificent landscape, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow at a session only about Antarctica, but I just wanted to bring it in as an example of one of these landscapes. Can you change? I'm afraid there's a bit too much light in the room to see, but this is an aurora taken in Antarctica, and because there's 3.5 months of darkness, we were treated to auroras almost constantly. When your sky is never interrupted by daylight, you can see auroras regularly. And I'm going to do another very short reading about what it's like to be out in the silence of that. The first night it dropped below minus 50 degrees C. I put on all the clothes I had and went to lie out on the ice. There was a subterranean stillness to the air. Exhaling gently into the silence, I heard an unfamiliar sound. the vapour in my breath was freezing immediately as it left my mouth. It rustled and tinkled like the very distant breaking glass. Some Arctic peoples have a word for the sound of breath freezing, but as I exhaled, there were halos of rainbow and gold formed by the frost crystals in my breath. And those Arctic peoples don't have a word for the colours that breath makes against the stars. So, if you just change on. There are disadvantages of living at minus 50. You have to dress up like this when you go out, with thermal underwear, and then you wear a neoprene face mask, and then a balaclava, then a rabbit fur hat. And but I made a pledge to myself when I arrived there. I would go out skiing every single day, no matter what the weather. And this is sometimes the effect. This is just the ice on my face is only condensation from my breath as I exhale. You just change on. And one of the wonderful things about living in the Antarctic is you can live with the penguins. I live very close to a colony of emperor penguins, the largest colony on Earth. And for those of you who know a little bit about emperor penguins, they're quite the most extraordinary species on the planet. These male emperor penguins fast for 4 months. They don't eat anything because the sea ice is frozen for 1,000 miles to 5 or 6 meters thick, and so they can't access the fish. And so they fast for the whole period of the winter until the sea ice starts to break up again. And I wrote a book about that. And when I got back from the Antarctic, I really wanted to make a tour to some parts of the Himalayas. And this is a photo taken on the Karakoram Highway, heading up from Abbottabad towards Sost, Tashkurgan, just as you approach the Gilgit Valley. And on that road, of course, there are a lot of Afghan and Pashtun traders who are doing the trade between Xinjiang in western China and all the way down into the Pakistani cities. I also travelled around Ladakh. This is the fortress at Leh, and if you just carry on, and visited some of that very striking, beautiful landscape of the high plateau, where there's almost no vegetation. This isn't a yak, I think it's a zo. It's a half hybrid yak. And you just move on. And I was very lucky to make it to Lhasa. This is the Potala Palace, going around the circuit of the Potala. And obviously I had a great many interesting political discussions, or attempted to have, but which I can also speak to people about later. You just wait. I haven't written a book about the Himalayas yet, but it's something that I'm thinking about and always putting down ideas for, and it's something that will come eventually. This is a piece I wrote about Ladakh for Granta, and I just want to finish off this tour of remote places by describing lastly a motorbike tour I made with my wife across Australia and New Zealand. Now, Australia and New Zealand, Sydney is a wonderful city, of course, but most of Australia is desert and very, very empty. So I drove from Perth to Sydney, and mostly the view is like this, which is very boring when you're driving a motorcycle. But at night time, when we stop the motorcycle and put up the tent to sleep in the outback, I've come across very few places where there's such a rich, beautiful silence as there is there in the outback. And from Australia, which is a very thinly populated country, 20 million in that enormous country, to move on to New Zealand, which is similarly very, very thinly populated. It's about twice the size of Britain. And this is the North Cape of New Zealand, where the Tasman Sea meets the Pacific Ocean. And I travelled from there down to the southern tip, and where this is a photograph of the Southern Cross. It's a constellation, cross-like constellation at the top of the picture, which is also a very beautiful place to go. Right at the end of New Zealand, there's very little in terms of development. The towns are very tiny, and you know when you look out onto the ocean that there's nothing until you get to Antarctica. But I live in Edinburgh now, So I hope I manage to charge my spirit, my soul with all these quiet places, because my life is very different now. It's very busy. I have the wonderful opportunity to make trips like this. I do a lot more talking than I used to when I did these journeys. And of course, I have 3 very small children, so life in my home is never quiet. There is constant noise from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Okay, and so thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. It was nice to see you the second time. I don't think I would tire of looking at your pictures and hearing your stories. As you already know, it's a very jealous person sitting across from you and asking you these questions. When I was reading your True North, and even now as you were speaking, you speak of your travels as a pilgrimage. The only one that I can contrast it to what you've written in True North, where you actually compare your experience to the pilgrimages by Christian priests, actually, but it isn't as if you are in love with that sort of an experience. I would like you to describe your experience as a pilgrim, actually, when you travel.
Yeah, the pilgrimage as an idea is, for many years in the West, has seemed to be decreasing. People have less and less enthusiasm for pilgrimage. There used to be, a very common aspect of medieval Catholic Christianity. Yeah, there was a network of pilgrimage trails all over Europe. But recently, in a secular way, they've started to become used again. People are making pilgrimages not just to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, but also all sorts of smaller pilgrimages within their own countries. And yet, the chapter in my book which describes the Faroe Islands meditates on the story of Dark Ages Irish monks who, in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, set out from Ireland in leather boats and sailed across the North Atlantic. And they just put themselves out there on the sea and expected the wind and the weather to decide where they would live. And there's definite evidence that they reached Iceland and Greenland. The traces of their boats have been found. And it's suspected some of them did make it to the New World, Newfoundland, New England. But the only definite archaeological evidence of that region is the Vikings, the Norse, that made it there. And that idea, I suppose, of setting yourself adrift into a landscape which is very unforgiving, but which offers you not only a test of yourself, but a test of your resources. It's a very romantic idea. Of course, it's kind of absurd, because we wouldn't go there unless I had some sort of knowledge of safety of my return. But it's still a very profoundly appealing idea to go somewhere where there are so few distractions, similar to the Irish monks felt, that you can let your mind settle and perhaps some truths might be revealed.
And also, while you were writing True North, you come across some Australians in the area. And there's almost a sense of fascination, I don't know, maybe even bewilderment, because you're actually chasing these sounds of silence, the silence and the vast landscapes. And suddenly these Australians come to you and say, it doesn't matter where we travel to, it basically is the travel itself.
Yeah, I'm always in awe wherever I've travelled in the world, and say I've been in quite a lot of countries, not as many as Wendell yesterday. No. He was talking about his 140 countries. But wherever I've gone, I've met Australians who have been everywhere, and who just, it's a way of life for them. Backpacking is just a way of life for them. And for me, it's not like that. I mean, I go places to experience the place. I have this sense, even though I'm not really getting a feel, because I'm often travelling through, and even, I spent 6 months in India, but 6 months is not a long time to see India, So these guys wouldn't be interested in trying to gain a real sense of the place they're in. For them, travel is the real journey. My travel is more rooted in this idea that I feel I've only got, if I'm lucky, 80 years or so. And so I want to see as much of the planet, become acquainted, even if it's in a very brief way, with as much of the planet as I can, while I can.
Also, when you write, you don't judge so much. you judge the Europeans and Americans a bit more harsh than the people in Arctic Europe, if you actually think about it. No, I'll tell you one instance why. Because there's this American who worked for Greenpeace in the book, and then you go, she seemed a bit talkative, bit silly, and you never use these words to describe the people that you actually, the native inhabitants of the area actually. And even this instance that I was sharing with you earlier, where you come across these little boys who actually play with this bird that actually has not been able to take flight and cannot fly. So they really throw the bird at each other until it dies. And there's silence after that. There's nothing that Gavin says or judges, and I'm thinking, where's Gavin lost? Why doesn't he say anything? It made me think I had to read that part in the book 3 times because it has such an impact on me.
Yeah, that scene takes place in the Faroe Islands, just in the centre of town, the park in the centre of town. Some boys had found a fledgling nest, a little chick inside that couldn't fly yet, and yeah, they were throwing at each other. So for me, I described that incident because for me on some level it's told me something about Faroese culture. A lot of things are extremely admirable about Faroese culture. You know, they have managed to survive over 1,000 years on this rock on which grass barely grows. Very hardy people, and I found that admirable. But there was a flip side to that. You know, whenever the Faroese are always in the news when they kill whales, for example. But the flip side of that killing whales is the fact that children are quite happy to kill fledglings. And I didn't want to judge that. I just wanted to offer it as an observation. This happened. I saw it. I witnessed it. The reader can take from that what they want to take. They can make that connection about an aspect of Faroese culture, and they could decide to disapprove, or they could say, oh yeah, you know, I can understand why that people might become like that. It's interesting what you say about being more judgmental of people from more metropolitan Europe, and I suppose maybe the roots of that are that because that is the milieu in which I grew up, metropolitan, urban, educated Europe. I feel maybe I'm more justified in passing any kind of judgment, even if it's a light touch, because it's what I'm familiar with, and I know the ethical background at which that person has grown up. But I couldn't say the same for an Inuit Greenlander, say, or some Faroese boys, or even people in the small fishing villages in Finnmark of Norway.
There is an instance when a Greenlander comes to you and says, so what do you think of me? It's okay to call me an Inuit, but then don't call me, you know, and then you say, no, I think of you as a Greenlander, and the man actually appreciates you for doing that. And then I can identify with that because a lot of Bhutanese tend to react in such a manner as well when you're seen as very exotic people, and that tends to take precedence over being a Bhutanese actually. I was shown that we have 10 minutes left. Just one question to you, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. I wanted to ask you about climate change actually. Do you write really because you want to tell these stories, or because you want to document that such a situation, such a people do exist, and in a way that we must accord the importance that is due to them because they are part of what humanity actually is? Your trip to Arctic Europe and your trip to Antarctica, and you're saying, okay, this is what I'm writing in your prologue, I should write that, and then you say, now this is what I give to you, do what you want with it, and perhaps you will do something with it. There is that hope.
Yeah, I don't know if I know why I write books at all. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what some of the other speakers here have to say about why they write. When I write, I certainly don't have an audience in mind. I am Salinger, J.D. Salinger had a wonderful line in one of his short stories, Seymour, an introduction, where he's quotes from a letter, and he's encouraging someone how to be a writer. And he says, it's a brother writing to a brother. He says, you were a reader long before you were a writer, so you must write the book you most want to read. That simple. Don't do an MFA in creative writing. Just write the book you want to read. And so, and I took that very much to heart. And so I don't generally write with an audience in mind, but the audience is only me, and I'm a very harsh critic. But I'm writing the book that I most want. And so when I made this journey around Arctic Europe, and yeah, in some ways I wanted to catch that memory, if you like, embed it in amber, hold it for what it was, a journey in the early years of the 21st century around these places which are changing fast because of climate change. Similarly, when I went to Antarctica for a year and a half, I thought, here I've had this experience of being in a landscape entirely absent of rocks, features, there's nothing the same size as me apart from emperor penguins in it. You know, everything is either impossibly vast or microscopically tiny, the pinprick of ice crystals in your skin with frostbite, or this blizzarding snow, or because you're 3.5 months with no sunlight, you become extraordinarily aware of the wheel of the constellations, because you can see them any hour of the day, and the sky is always clear, and so you really get a feel for the way the constellations turn. And so you walk out and you look up and you see where the Southern Cross is, and you know about what time of day it is, and it's wonderful. And I wanted to capture again that experience, what it's like to go through a year in a place with none of the usual markers of the passage of time, and hold it somehow, and keep it, and then offer it to people who will never have the chance to experience that. Try and use a language which sort of squeezes adjectives and tries to force new metaphorical ways of trying to picture this for people. Yeah.
Fantastic. Opening up the floor to questions now. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Deepthi. Bear Grylls from Man vs. Wild says that if you ever have to ask anybody why you're doing something, why are you an adventurer or why are you a runner, I mean, the point is lost because they do what they do, why they do. But my question would be, I'm a travel writer too, and it's a personal dilemma where when you tell somebody you're a travel writer, they think, oh wow, that's so awesome, that's the ultimate job. But it comes with a lot of, you get what I mean. So how do you balance that? I mean, you're a doctor, but how would somebody else who is into something like this balance the two without making it sound oh so glamorous? Yeah.
No, it's interesting, and I think sort of if we try and define the terms, I mean, there's lots and lots of different kinds of travel writing, and the fact that I am a doctor frees me enormously because it's my wages from medicine which put a roof over my head and buy new shoes for the kids. So I don't have to do travel writing work that I don't really, really want to do. Whereas I have colleagues who are writers in the UK who have to do a lot of bit piece work, shorter articles for lifestyle magazines and things like that, which distracts them from what they really want to do, which is write book-length narratives. And so, in a sense, I don't know if I can answer your question because because of my unusual situation, I'm only just writing whatever I want to, and if the publishers don't like it, then that's okay, But if they want to publish it, then that's okay, because I have an alternative way of supporting myself. I think when you have to make your living at it entirely, then yes, it twists the way you practice, but it can also be wonderfully liberating. Absolutely, you get a phone call tomorrow and said, we need you to fly to Kerala tomorrow to write a 2,000-word article about Kerala. You think, great, fabulous, I'm going on holiday for my work. But I would find that very disruptive because of my home life and my personal life, and so I much prefer this. It takes me 2 or 3 years to write a book. So.
Some more questions?
Stunned silence.
You do like silence, but
that would be a fitting way to end this.
Any more questions? No, I want to ask you one question if we have about, 4 minutes now, so we could take, about economy. I was telling you how I could associate so much with what you were writing in True North because I am a Bhutanese, and I think a lot of Bhutanese who would read True North would actually experience what I experienced. The vulnerability of the people in this area, and at the same time that they don't really have much of a choice when it comes to higher education, when it comes to job opportunities, that you would make the choice to come back to this area if it gave you something more than something else that somewhere else would give to you. And you've pretty much given quite a few examples. For instance, the painter and his wife who had to leave, and he was actually painting in the middle of the ocean when there's a storm because he wants to experience that while he's doing it. But why did he come back? It wasn't really for economic reasons that he came back, but it gave him what you were actually searching for, that he finds perhaps solitude and inspiration in that area. He left the hustle and bustle of a town to go back to that. But then you can identify with being small areas, small economies, and the kind of shared experiences that we have actually also.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities between circumpolar communities like those in Lapland or Greenland or the Canadian Inuits. Even if we talk about in terms of their remoteness and being circumpolar community, places like the Falkland Islands and Ushuaia in Patagonia, Argentinian Patagonia. Because there's a lot of similarities between those places and between high mountain or mountainous communities, whether they're in the Andes or whether they're in the Himalayas. And it's just because of this unifying aspect of being marginal to the main driver of the culture, which is either further north if you're in Patagonia, or here, drivers of the culture coming from North India, or in the Andes, for example. So there are a lot of similarities in terms of access. These are difficult places to get to. There's small communities. They've traditionally struggled very much in order to be self-sustainable in terms of food that they grow. And so whenever I've been travelling in the Himalayas, I've noticed a great deal of similarities between places at completely the opposite end of the globe, because human beings are human beings, and the environment that we live in shapes us. And these are ultimately quite similar environments in terms of the pressure they place on us.
I think we're out of time, but there are two instances in the book where specific... Oh, one question. Do we have time for a question?
Yeah, I think it does. But it's quite a common. Yeah, well, no, not specifically. It's in the sense that he's making a reference to a very a cultural impression we have of the importance of orientation and a compass needle. A compass needle will always point us home, or a compass needle will always point us in. And we have an enormous tradition in the West of idealising Arctic landscapes, especially through the 19th century, and the Victorian British were obsessed, with the Northwest Passage and endless expeditions going into the Arctic and disappearing, and they saw it as a real testing ground and a place of where truth might emerge, where you would confront yourself and come out with some truths. And so I think that's perhaps what Yeats is suggesting.
Bhutan is mentioned in the book in a sentence because you meet a fellow traveller who's travelled through Tibet to Bhutan, the closed kingdom of Bhutan. And I looked at when your book was published, 2008, so I was thinking, yeah, okay, we were a little close that time. Then also another one, which is very interesting. He mentions a very immense phallus, which is a Norse god actually called Frey. It's the god of fertility, I think. And I was like, oh, not that. There's another similarity there, glaring similarity actually, if I could submit that to you. But
yeah, I don't know. Here is this fertility cult is also associated with horses. In Norway, they associate it very much with horses, with stallions, and they have a day which is the day of stallions, and it's associated with Frey. And they have the most powerful stallion. If you sacrifice the most powerful stallion, that was an extremely powerful thing to do in the pre-Christian Norse.
Very rich books that Gavin writes. I thoroughly enjoyed reading his True Knot, and I do hope I get my hands on Empire Antarctica. But it was a joy talking to you, Gavin. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. I'm sorry that it was sold out.
Thank you so much.